Hello, everyone. I'm your host, Terry Lynn Rodriguez, Chapter and Member Relations Analyst at IIBA, and it is my pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, From the Business Analyst to the Boardroom. IIBA is an independent, not-for-profit professional association serving the global business analysis community. Dedicated to elevating the discipline of business analysis, we work to maintain the global standard for the practice and certifications and provide our global community with relevant tools, resources, and networking opportunities. Just a few housekeeping items before I introduce our speaker. During the webinar, please feel free to enter your questions into the question box on the GoToWebinar control panel, and we will try to get to as many as possible throughout the presentation. The webinar is being recorded and will be posted to the webinar archives on IIBA's website within 10 business days. Now I am pleased to introduce our speaker, Guy Shone. Guy started his career as a business analyst back in the late 90s, and he became the first principal BA in a large global finance company, where he is at least partially responsible for hiring the previous president of our IIBA UK chapter, Adrian Reed, something he still likes to brag about. He went on to become the global head of research for a large financial services group, and then for a UK government body specializing in research that contributed to government strategy. Guy is now one of the world's leading business journalists, reaching tens of millions of TV viewers every week in over 20 different countries. He is also the CEO of the research business Explain the Market, providing board-level advice to many of the most famous international brands. Guy, welcome. I'll turn it over to you.
Well, thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks to all of you for taking the time to tune in. Appreciate you all taking the time, and you know, considering we've got so many people tuning in from all around the world, it's it's great to see so many people flooding in now. I want to pay tribute to the IIBA for putting this on, and say thank you to Delvin, Jeffrey, Anne, and all of their amazing staff for connecting us up to enable us to do this. And already there've been lots of questions coming in, many of them centering on this common challenge of how to be a more effective influencer, of how to overcome difficult stakeholders and generally become more listened to. But I believe that's important, but I believe it's also part of a wider, bigger issue that sort of goes beyond that. I think there's a need to be much more than an effective influencer. I think being taken seriously in boardrooms by boardroom colleagues, as being sort of instinctively viewed as an equal, is both important and it's something different to being an effective influencer. I think it's so often the missing part of the puzzle for BAs. Being a great influencer in the conventional sense doesn't necessarily fill that gap, because so often the dynamic stays the same. And part of the reason it does is that sometimes we, I think, allow it to. In fact, sometimes through our own cultural conditioning, we kind of almost encourage it to. And if this is the first bizarre reference of the afternoon from me. There'll be many more, but if you look at novelists like Ishiguro, for example, they deal with this subject. Even if we look at TV shows like Downton Abbey, we see a talented, loyal servant is someone who's very, very valuable. She's rightly treated with respect. She's a very key and an important part of the organism, but she could never really be a proper decision maker. She could never get invited to join the top table to discuss the proper strategy. She could devise strategies that were at a lower level, but never a strategy that defines the organization. The very best that she could hope for would be promotion to head servant, perhaps presiding over other servants. But anything more than that would frankly just make everybody feel a bit uncomfortable. I've been a servant, I've been a principal servant, and I've been a head servant before I committed the despicable blasphemy of breaking into the boardroom in my own right, and then even worse impertinence, becoming the person that the TV networks use to analyze businesses. But I remember feeling frustrated as a BA that decision makers wouldn't listen to me sometimes. I remember feeling offended as a lead BA that directors sometimes just saw me as a provider of human resources. And I remember talking to teammates, co-workers, about those executives, those directors who just didn't get it. If only we could make them listen to us, we'd all agree that the business would be in better shape. And we were a clever, hardworking, honourable bunch of people. But on that question, we were wrong. And it was worse than that. It was almost impossible for us to see that we were wrong. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to share 10 provocations based on just my own experience, 10 suggestions that I hope are going to be in some way useful. I've got no slides, no charts. I'm just going to spend a few minutes talking on each theme, and we're going to break for questions, probably once in about 15 minutes time, and then again at the end. So if you get bored of my face, I can understand. I can understand that. Feel free to eat food, drink coffee. I've got my Nespresso cup next to me. There's really nothing that you need to do other than just listen. So what I'd like to do is crack on with the first provocation. So chapter one, if you like, is stop educating and start learning. And if I think back to when I both worked in and then led big teams of business analysts, two examples spring to mind. One was a finance business that covered the UK, South Africa, Europe, and a few other territories. And the other was a UK government organisation. And common to both were colleagues, as I've said, who were smart and honourable and hardworking. But also present was a sense that we had knowledge and expertise that those nearer the top of the hierarchy ought to listen to, a niggling frustration that if we could only get those directors to pay attention, then the business would run more effectively. And at the same time as harbouring this view, we couldn't really see what we at that time didn't know. And out of that team of roughly 30 people that I'm thinking of, the percentage of that group who'd had any experience at all of being a director of a company with a turnover of over $500 million was zero. None of us had ever done the job. We literally, I mean, I'm not taking an anti-intellectual position, but in one sense, we literally couldn't know. Now, I've got two kids, and I'm sure many parents who are tuning into this would agree with me. The realities of actually being a parent are different in so many ways to the theory of being a good parent, and also qualitatively different from what we imagine it's going to be like beforehand. And so I've now seen this from both sides, and I can report back that in my experience, it isn't that the theory is correct, but the boardroom pressures won't allow its application. That's not it. It's that so much of the theory is irrelevant, not useful to the realities of running a company. So there is a missing education piece, but it's completely the other way round from the way that I'd envisaged it. And BAs with a background in qualitative research techniques tend to be good at spotting this, particularly disciplines like ethnography. And I found that in my crossover with research later in my career. So taking time to think about what boardrooms want is very important. Not what boardrooms need, what boardrooms want. That's the critical thing to think about. And so just very quickly, and we'll go into more of this later on. We'll distill you know, a bit more of this later on, but a quick set of examples of what I see board members tuning into and prioritizing now. So I spend a fair bit of time talking to C-level people in the meetings. I also, on the TV shows that I do, have to interview CEOs, and we talk at length about their priorities. So that's where this data is coming from. So it's not perfect. It's be easy to dispute it, but it is, you know, it's reasonably useful. So one of the things that boards are particularly tuned into right now, I describe as information that's indisputably accurate and points the company in a positive direction, paints the company in a positive light versus its competitors, and relates to a big theme. So, for example, lots of the biggest, I'm looking at the moment at the biggest 400 companies in the world, with the various groups of different media, and one of the things that the C-level people I'm talking to are almost the first few things that they say is that they're looking around decarbonisation commitments post COVID, and they're looking at a time frame between 6 weeks and 6 months. They're interested in any paper, any document, anything that comes through that helps them construct their story for things like COP26. They're particularly interested in things that evidence how their own infrastructure enables diversity in some way. So those are the things at the top of their agenda at the moment. Now, those things change, but there is a commonality, which is about enabling them to tell the story, but tell the story to people that may not be the sort of people that business analysts tend to work with day to day. So the investment community, financial journalists, the media in general. So it's really important to practice telling your story about whatever it is that you're doing, but telling it with those very strictly imposed restrictions on yourself. So that means things like 1 page maximum, you know, and if you can, less than that. And also communicating what you're talking about in a way that could be instantly understood by a journalist. And a good example of that would be to pick a global news network. So there are a few that I work for. So Euronews, SABC in South Africa, the BBC, Bloomberg, whoever. If you take some time and watch the way stories are constructed, there's a syntax, there's a hierarchy, there are fashions and trends about how things are described. That's not trivial. I mean, it's the opposite. That's the substantive part. So, and it's not just important for sort of marketing and PR people to understand, because one of the things that I think's, you know, unfortunately always frustrated me about the BA community is that I met such great people, so talented, so clever, you know, really honourable folk, really want to make a difference. But I can't think of any community of people less who sort of, where there are less of them in boardrooms in C-level positions. I mean, accountants, there's loads. Chartered marketeers, there's loads. Treasury executives we get. Even now HR people do it. But business analysts still just aren't perceived as being people that would which is ironic, because so many of them have such great skills and insights to offer. So the way in which we construct our reports, our conversations, our messages, I think needs to change. And we need to change the way we think, to move away from let's try and educate others to our standard, or orientate things to the way we naturally communicate with each other. And instead of that, try to understand how boardrooms communicate with each other, with investors, and with the media, because increasingly it's the same message. They're not different conversations now, and I can say that for certain. You know, I watch boardroom executives talk to each other. I then talk to them as a journalist, and I also watch conversations between them, the investment analyst population, and investors themselves. The language is similar, so there's a common language between those communities, and then a disconnect often between the way people in the organization sometimes like business analysts, and that's a problem, and it's going to get worse if it's not addressed. The other thing that boards are obsessed about at the moment is external network. So people who have got relationships that are interesting, where their experience and their relationships can be drawn upon. Now that, in my observation, is taking on a much less hierarchical nature than it used to do. So when I started working, I was, you know, members of all sorts of fora and different societies that used to kind of provide strategic information, conference and events and things like that. But it was still very hard for me to kind of pass that insight on to people at the top of the organization. My observation is that's changed, and there's probably some research effect in that, because I'm in a different position now. But I think organizations generally are having to look differently at external sources of information. One of the reasons they're doing that is the activism community now is much bigger. It's much more of a serious operation. Investment activism is now something that's taken very seriously. The role of social media is meaning that organizations are having to take scrutiny and also get insight from sources that perhaps previously they may have been dismissive of. So that presents a real opportunity. And I think this is, I'll probably go on to say more about this, but I think this is really important for business analysts to develop a reputation and a profile in their own right, distinct from the discipline of being a business analyst, because it becomes problematic, and ultimately it ends up denigrating the discipline if we start expressing our value to the company only in terms of our particular tools and techniques and disciplines that are part of the role that we do. And I'll talk a bit more about that in the opinion section. And the other thing, finally, just that boards are obsessed about is new innovations. But this is very, very nuanced and specific. So only if they can be implemented in the next 6 months, only if they can be implemented with almost no disruption, and only if the benefits are clear, specific, and non-conceptual. And that last one's really important. So it means expressing it in terms that are not qualitative and are not subjective either. And a good example would be, you know, blockchain is going to democratize the way we do X. No one's going to read that. Okay, so that's, you know, that's an example of the sort of thing that would be instantly thrown in the bin. Positioning something like blockchain as an external comms opportunity, or a specific R&D project, or, you know, or a renewed time frame as to when we can move from something that's an R&D project to something that can take the weight of the commercial model. Okay, that's interesting, but not, you know, the themes you see done to death on LinkedIn. That's going to turn people's attention off. If you want to do something more specific, like the transition to cloud infrastructure, and the sort of the from capex to opex sort of narrative that runs underneath it to catch the attention of the CFO with some specific innovations and benefits along that, then that's interesting. But all of it again has to be expressed in with brevity that would sometimes take people's breath away. I once did a half marathon and spoke to a friend of mine that was a regular long distance runner, and I was talking about how am I going to lumber my chubby frame around 13 miles, and he said what you need to do is start slow and slow down. And I said no, you must mean start slow and then speed up. And he said no, he said everything in you will want you to go too fast. He said it's a bit like when pop singers sing at a concert. Whenever they sing it live, because of the nerves, it just comes out quicker than it does on the I was going to say record then, but the track, because and the singer doesn't perceive that that's happened. So there's a similar thing I think with brevity, is that you need to practice trying to do this in unimaginably brief terms. Imagine you're writing for the National Enquirer or the Sun, or something, a real tabloid publication, and every word that's not absolutely essential needs to be stripped out. That's a real discipline, I think, that's important, and it gives you there are side benefits to putting oneself through that exercise too. So that's the piece about education. It's partly about perception, it's partly about specifics, and it's partly about things to try and practice that maybe are not currently practiced. And there might be aspects of that might lead to new best practice applications that currently perhaps aren't addressed or are not addressed sufficiently. I'm just going to talk about one more thing, and then I'm going to, because I've got one eye over here and one eye over here on the questions that are coming in, and then I'm going to talk to Rose about any questions that are popping up. The next point, the next 2 points, I'm going to concertina together. But what I've said is learn to love opinion and how boardrooms view toolkits. And learn to love opinion is an important thing, but it is quite difficult to formulate a sort of a direction around. But I'm going to try and do that. My view is that leadership by spreadsheet doesn't work, and when we deride opinion, and that doesn't happen so much now, but it certainly did as when I was sort of coming through the ranks, we sort of set off down a road where we're in danger of making the individual person appear relatively unimportant. And that's a problem, because boardrooms are driven by decisions, information, and individuals. They're not driven by toolkits. Now, toolkits are important, but they're not the things that get discussed. So boardrooms talk about people, they talk about personalities, different character traits, whose personality is shining through, whose personality is better suited to something else. So they also talk about what information do we need to make this decision. And then they also talk about the art and the science of decision making. Now, if we're not providing assets or inputs, or we're not demonstrating in our behavior things that align to those important areas, well, then of course we're going to be destined to never be invited in, because there's no obvious utility to bringing us into that conversation. So I think that's important, and I think opinion is important. When I used to interview people, I've no idea, I've been bragging about working briefly with Adrian Reed. I've no idea. But I've no idea whether it happened when we had an interview conversation, but it certainly happened with other people that I interviewed. I always wanted to know, what do you think about what's happening in the market at the moment? I didn't ask people well, I did, but my first point wasn't to ask people, what's your, which toolkit would you apply to solve this problem? The first thing I wanted to know is, what do you think? I wanted to know do you is there some substance to your understanding? And for me, for there to be substance, there has to be opinion. Otherwise, there's almost no point to us being there. We might as well just create an algorithm to do decision making by default. So that's important. So that's one of direction, and I think we need to slightly retrack where that's going. So this is not a let's throw everything out. It's just I just think that needs a slightly different weighting in terms of emphasis to where we're going. Goodness, people disagree so ferociously that they're wailing with fury. I'm sorry about that. The other one is that I wanted to mention before I speak to Rose is how boardrooms, therefore, in my experience, view toolkits. Generally speaking, what boardrooms want is that they have almost a hierarchy. They want the answer first, right? They want the answer first before the explanation, before the workings, before the rationale. And that's really important. And so often I see that you know, boardroom executives will ask for the answer, and the first thing they get is the beginnings of a narrative that explains the rationale, and that doesn't work. So the answer should come first. They want to then link that answer to a theme that's recognized externally as important, and then they want to understand how that answer has been arrived at. And then crucially, they want to immediately understand how that's going to demonstrate the company in a positive light. So again, if we're constructing things that can't obviously help with that, or can't help without some tinkering, then what we're really doing is we're handing over a problem to people. So again, another reason why, of course, people wouldn't have the desire to always invite us in, or to change the dynamic to bring us in where we haven't been brought in before. Relative comparisons are useful. Developing the art of being directional in your conclusions, I think, is useful, because again, this is how conversations to develop in boardrooms. The ability to give a sense of X, or generally where is the trajectory going. So that answer needs to be formulated in the style of an opinion, but supported with data, but not just data. No, not even just insight, but an opinion, which I think is something different in the hierarchy. And I think we don't touch on it enough. In fact, sometimes we don't touch on it at all. And then I also think the other thing, and this may cause Delvin to immediately pull the plug and tell me never to come back to the IIBA again, but I'll take the risk that that this is received in the spirit of helpfulness, because that's certainly the intention. Most boardrooms don't care about your group identity. They don't care that you are an accountancy professional, or a business analyst, or a chartered marketeer. They find that annoying. It's an additional bit of information they haven't asked for. And if you watch the way that boardroom politics works, and you watch the way that people change roles, you'll see a CMO being a HR director. You'll see that really what you've got is just a collection of individuals who are extraordinarily effective at getting things done, and who are unusual in their ability not to get distracted by other things. That's really what they are, and they don't really care about the discipline development. So I'm not saying that you shouldn't care about it either, but what I'm saying is, when you're communicating and developing things to try and win these people over, it's a mistake to start to sell the profession, because at best it'll be seen as a distraction, at worst it'll be seen as an irritant, and it will mark you out as being someone who isn't in that group of people that makes those decisions. There you go. So that's phrased in a provocative manner, but it was intended to be helpful. So I'm just going to pause for breath very, very quickly. I'm going to look across at the questions that have come in, while seamlessly, hopefully, asking Rose if she has any questions that I can answer. And let's take about sort of 5-6 minutes on this, if that's okay. Rose.
Hi everyone, I'm Rosalind and I work as part of the marketing team here at IIBA. So we do have many great questions that came in, that are still coming in. I will go to one,
Okay.
read out the question. So it says, I also work as a BA in the UK public sector in a very command and control environment. Do you have any general advice in how to overcome difficult stakeholders at a senior rank who are not conditioned to take advice but give and receive direct orders? Perhaps you have an example from working with the UK government.
Yeah, okay, thank you. That's a great question. And I think I can see from some of these coming that it's actually plenty of people have asked that sort of question in different ways. So that's a great question to run with. So thank you for the question. Now, there are a number of things I'm going to talk about in a minute. Some themes like getting the right sponsor, some things like how to be yourself rather than a practitioner. So some of those themes I think will help with that. But I think primarily there's a number of things to do. It's very difficult when you're in an overtly hierarchical culture to do a job that satisfies the people you work for, but also stand out. It's very difficult to do, and it requires a sort of subtlety and a mixture of sort of compliance and tactical rule breaking, if you like. One thing that I think can work quite well. Generally, I think modelling others is a bad idea. But there are certain things which you can see that people in that community that you're trying to win over tend to do, those social norms. And if you can mirror that, then that can be quite useful. So going back to what I was saying at the start, quite dramatically about this idea of being a servant and the sort of the class or caste structure almost, in an organization stopping you from breaking through. I think too often I see BAs kind of talking about hierarchy and acknowledging difference and talking about levels and they subtler, they do it more subtly now, but it's still the same thing. You never hear people in the boardroom talking about levels or seniority or talking about senior colleagues or using any of that sort of language. So I would, if you can, try to resist the temptation to do that, even if you're thinking it. So we need to be getting across to people that we are an equal person. We have just as much right to have the conversation as we, that job titles are rather transient things. And you're a successful individual in your own right with a contribution that includes opinion to make. And I think it's important to do that, to set the tone. I think you can also do that within reason for being clear about what you'll tolerate and what you won't tolerate. And you need to be careful about that, obviously. So I wouldn't want anybody to do anything that would, where they would go too far with that and be seen as being difficult. But I think the things I've spoken about, if you can talk the same language, I would not reference hierarchy at all in anything that you do or say. You have to work to it, but it doesn't need to be spoken about all the time. I would also make it clear that as well as being a practitioner, a BA, you're also a person with different character traits that may, you might have a very similar set of character traits to people who are on the board. The chances are that you do, because there aren't that many different personality types. So I would major on that. That can be particularly useful when you're looking for a sponsor, and that's particularly helpful. I would also make it known to people what your specialist interests are across the organization. If you're someone that's particularly interested in the application of a certain technology, or you're someone that's got an obscure background in something that, where there's some learning. So I would start to very gradually make yourself known as being more than just an efficient operator. And the difficult side of that command and control structure. Now, this is difficult because I never found that very easy. I was a sort of personality where I would become frustrated, which would then lead me to get on a sort of moral high horse and start grandstanding. And I'm not sure whether that was ever really particularly effective. But I think if you can find your own way of tolerating and ignoring the nonsense and just focusing on the positive, that's useful. But I wouldn't descend into what I would call dishonesty to do that. So I wouldn't, you know, if somebody picks a fight with you, I wouldn't pretend that they haven't picked a fight with you. I don't think there's anything mature or sophisticated about that. You know, I think it's perfectly possible to be honest and cut through a distraction where you can without being rude. But it's very, very difficult. But I think as a starting point, I would certainly start to behave as though you're already a decision maker, because the chances are you're already doing things in your own life that many people who sit in boardrooms may be unable to do as effectively as you. So we have to get rid of this sort of this deference that we sometimes sleepwalk into, because it's part of what's causing this gap that's developing, and this lack of representation in the boardroom. Okay, shall we go on just to a few more points and then we'll dip back into questions? There are a lot of questions, Rose, so I think I'm going to go through, just as a little warning to you, I'm going to go through some more points and then try and have a bit more time at the end to actually get into some of the detail of the questions. Is that okay?
Sure, definitely.
Okay, great. So just going back to a little bit of what we've spoken about, this idea of being yourself rather than a practitioner. So this is not to denigrate the idea of being a practitioner or the skills and tools and learning that are absolutely essential in order to be an effective BA. But it's really to add a layer on top of that, which sometimes can be the difference. And I found that in my career, some of the things which were seen initially, I think, as problematic, personality traits, a curiosity, an irritability towards sort of command and control structures, a belief that, you know, I wanted to be part of that decision-making group, and I couldn't see why I wouldn't be invited to be, you know. So I think we need to be careful that we don't give people the message that disruption is fine as long as it's sort of neat disruption, you know, disruption that sort of fits within, you know, disruption that doesn't actually disrupt, right? Disruption that sits only within the categories that HR deem as being appropriate. You know, the very point of disruption is, you know, that it ought to make people feel uncomfortable. So I think just the right level of roguery, just the right level of noising people up, as my Glaswegian friends would say, I think is important. I think that's important. If you're not irritating anyone at all, then you're probably always going to be, you know, a very effective servant. So that's difficult to manage. Only the individual can figure out the best way of managing that. But it is essential. At some point, we need to grasp and snatch and be a little bit Machiavellian about things. And that's a tricky thing. That's a tricky thing to do. But being ourselves, I think, is really important. So getting clear on what we're good at and what we're not good at, and I think also getting clear on who we are and where our strengths are and our passions are before we then start to look at the different categories that are available is important. It sort of doesn't work if we look at the categories that are available and then try and figure out which one we are. That's the same thing. You're just asking someone else who they'd like you to be, and you're choosing, you know. So I think that's something that that little bit of soul searching is, I think, is really important. And again, it's another thing that we need to do in order to bridge this gap. You know, as I said before, I can't think of any other professional group that's less represented in the boardroom. So that's important too. So you're a person first, and a BA second. And you know, hopefully Delvin would agree with that. I also think that starting to understand where the sort of suite of best practice tools and sort of categories of learning could be developed would be interesting. So I think part of how to develop that skills gap is really getting quite forensic about what it's like
Hello,
to
can you hear me?
be. Hi, somebody was breaking through. Sorry if you've just been. If we've cut you off, please don't feel that we're not trying to be rude. It was just a technical thing. But part of the missing link, I think, is about trying to understand what it's like to be one of those people that are making the decisions that we're facing off to. That's something that sounds like a straightforward thing to do, but isn't straightforward. And again, if we think about almost performing our own ethnography, I think that's so stakeholder analysis doesn't work for this. It's almost the antithesis of the approach that's the right approach. What we need to be doing is trying to see if we can feel what it's like to feel the same pressures as our stakeholders, trying to understand what it's like if our priorities are vision, interacting with lawyers, how the company is seen externally. You know, if those are our priorities, what is it that we need? You know, what is it that we're looking for all the time? That doesn't necessarily tend to a traditional stakeholder analysis doesn't give you that, because it doesn't change you. It just gives you another set of tools to use. So any sort of thing you can do that gives you that kind of ethnographic change in understanding, where you feel the pressure, and that experience then starts to give you a different viewpoint, I would recommend doing that. And there are simple things that you can do. If you can shadow people, if you can take some time to take as a comment somewhere that's completely different, all of those things I think are really beneficial. But it takes tremendous discipline to you know, force ourselves to think with a different set of values and priorities. But I think it can be tremendously advantageous. I think it's really important also to help find our voice and our style. So if you go within a boardroom, I do quite a lot of media training with C-level people. If you go into boardrooms, there's a huge amount of attention placed on this, and there's a sort of a it's almost acknowledged as being correct sometimes. It's an implicit cultural thing, but it almost becomes acknowledged that if you're a C-level person, then your style, your personality, how you bring your voice to what you do is essential. But if you sit further down the org chart, then to do that is inefficient or frivolous or a distraction. And of course, that makes no sense at all, because we're all trading with each other and trying to influence each other all the time. And the way that we influence each other is primarily through those factors. So again, that for me is another glaring example where it's non-trivial, it's incredibly difficult, substantial, multifarious kind of, you know, it's really there's a depth of effort required in that area to get it right. And so I think it's worth putting time into doing that, to understanding what is your particular voice, what's your particular style that you bring to the work you do, how do you bring best practices to life, and how is that different from the way other people do it, because we all need to market ourselves within our organizations and externally too, and if we're not even sure, then or even worse, if we think it's somehow preferable to just be a sort of a generic resource with no opinion, then that gap's not going to close, you know, and you know, that's fine, but it's not going to, people are not going to break through. I had to do that, and it's uncomfortable. It's very uncomfortable. And if you stick your head up and you say you want to be different and you're not sure you agree with stuff, then people are, you know, critics are going to come. It's hard, but you can't change anything if you don't do that. Okay, now I want to talk about the right sponsor, ignoring weaknesses, a slightly mischievous thing about don't do NLP, and then textbooks. But I just want to take some questions too. So I'm going to run through those very quickly, and then Rose, I'm going to come to you, and I want to try and take as many questions as we can before we run out of time. So sponsorship, I think, is very important, and I would one of the critical things I would do in terms of getting a sponsor, I would not ask for permission. I think that's really important. The moment you ask for permission, you're almost taking the magic and the potential out of the exercise. So I think that for me, that's the first important point. Do not ask for permission to get a sponsor. And if it helps your, if it increases your chances of getting a sponsor, then don't document it anywhere. Make it secret. So build a real personal relationship with someone else who happens to be in a position of authority, and spend time with them, and be likable to each other, and develop learning that way. That is 1,000 times more effective than sitting down with HR and your line manager and documenting a plan for who would be an appropriate, grandparent, or whatever these terms are. That's playing the game, and it might get you some points in your personal development plan, but it's not really going to get the real thing going. So I would do it that way informally. I would watch people. I would look for the people who you think you get on with, people who you see the world in a similar way to you, who seem to be like you want to be like. And I would prioritize that ahead of individual departmental disciplines, ahead of industry experience, and ahead of who other people suggest you ought to speak to. That's what I did. I found a CEO who I got on with, and that was much more important, and led to me thinking, well, this learning is mine. I'll do with it what I want to do with it, and it's going to help me be more self-expressed, and that's going to lead to me learning more, and that's going to lead to me being more effective. For me, that was the right sequence to go down. So obviously, I'd recommend that. And then weaknesses. My reflection on my own career is too much time was spent trying to level up weaknesses, so that I became a rounded contributor, with a broad set of skills. I think that's part of the problem, and part of why often BAs are so anonymous, is that it takes, you need to be really, really, really good at something and create an awful lot of attention before anyone will notice that you're really, really good at it. And there's not a lot of time, a 25, 30-year career is over quite quick. So my view is that it's a waste of time and energy, unless you have to, focusing on trying to get those weaknesses up. I would find someone that can do it for you. I would find ways around it, and I would double down on those things if you can, that really make your heart sing, where there's an alignment between your character, your skills, and your sort of natural talents. And then the no NLP provocation was really about, I found it, it's easy to speak from the heart when you've had a little bit of success. It comes with that comes a certain freedom. It's harder when you're constrained by particularly the command and control structure that our colleague mentioned in his question earlier. But nevertheless, I still think it's the right approach. I think it's I think the earlier in one's career that speaking from the heart can become something that we do, the better. And so learning techniques and revising and all that sort of stuff, I've always found it to to give me an impression of all the lyrics but no music. You know, it sort of sounds great, but I don't really want to, you know, I don't have, there's no magic there. So I would encourage people to let what they really think and feel come through as often as they possibly can. And you don't need someone else's techniques to do that. You just need to practice saying what you feel and what you think. So I would recommend that, and find your own ways of doing that. Spend time thinking about how you might allow that to happen a little bit more this week than it did last week. And finally, entrepreneur autobiographies, the sort of guru minefield out there. There's a lot of trickery and distraction and kind of false hope given to people. So I would be very, very tactical with well, the first thing I'd say actually is I don't know, I mean, some people seem to do so much reading of business books that it astonishes me that they have time to do that and work and do anything else. I think people should spend more time being introspective and figure out how they're going to do something different next week, because I think the general behavior that I've seen is that only a tiny percentage of people dramatically change their action, their activity, but a huge number of people read and read and read and read and talk conceptually about things whilst not changing their action. And I can't, unless you know you're philosophically minded, and I'm sure it's interesting, but I think if you want to do something different, to develop yourself in a different way, then I think the test and learn approach is far more effective, because you can't just isolate out your character and personality. So there you go. So just some things that I've seen work. Let's go to questions whilst we've still got some time. Rose, give me some difficult questions.
Sure. So I kind of see a theme in terms of the questions coming in. I'll just read one or two of them. So the first one would be, how can I communicate my need to be part of the boardroom without seeming like a threat? And how can I learn about the communication styles of C-level executives so we can relate better to them?
Okay, the first thing to do is just watch them, right? Just watch them as they go about. You're probably going to get some chance to see people informally around an office. It's harder now that we're all locked down, but generally speaking, I would pay attention to their style. You'll see it in the communications they send out. You'll see how they behave around the office. You'll probably know what particular interests and sports they like, and do they live by a lake and enjoy outdoor sports, or do they, it's much more. This stuff seems trivial, but it's not. It's absolutely not trivial at all. It's what you're trying to do is you're trying to figure out if you can connect with other people, and most people connect with other people because they like them. It's not some big strategic reason, or it's not even about the substance that they're dealing with. It's because they like people. People want to spend time and chat to people that they appear to like. So you do need, that does need to be your number one part of your strategy. Sorry, that was about how do you communicate with them. So use those channels, those informal channels. Ask for people's advice. You have to have a heart of stone. I mean, I've run a department for a global organization. If I got an email from somebody and they said, look, I know you're really busy, but please could I just grab 5 minutes because I want to get some advice about my career. You'd have to have a heart of stone not to feel kind of flattered and like you'd love to give someone a hand. It's almost, as long as you phrase it in the right way, it's very hard for that sort of thing to backfire. But the important thing is to test and learn. You don't need to take a huge amount of risk, but you do need to do something. You do need to risk some embarrassment, and you do need to risk some failure, and then figure it out afterwards. And what was the other question, Rose? Sorry.
Okay, so it's
One was, sorry.
communicate my need to be part of the boardroom without seeming like a threat.
Yeah, I think the seeming like a threat is overstated often psychologically. I think if we take out, as I said earlier, we need to take out references to hierarchies, take out references to who's in charge of who, reporting lines, just strip all of that out of your communication and just talk in a friendly, polite way about the job that's being done, not about who's, you see all these ridiculous training courses where they encourage people to, talk in the first person. What I'm expecting from this. It's most of it's nonsense, right? It's just think about how two equal people who really liked each other and wanted to be helpful to each other would communicate, and just focus on being really helpful. And if you want to get sponsorship, then you ask for a coffee and you say, I'd love to just grab 5 minutes to try and learn how you got to where you are. Be a little bit flattering without being sycophantic, and be very, very short with that communication. And if you want to, if you're talking about project related work or day-to-day work, then just focus on the particular thing you're doing and give everything a lightness of touch. Be someone who's likable, who gets the job done, who just appears to be an equal. That's really, really important, and that will go a long way. It ought to be, the answer ought to sound more sort of serious than that, but in my experience, that's what does it. Let them see you as a person. Talk about your family and your interests if you can, if it's appropriate, and try and make them remember you. But don't talk about hierarchy or reporting lines, or there's no need to be deferential in your language. Just doing the job will be enough.
That's all the time we have for questions, but keep an eye on IIBA's social media channels in the coming weeks, where we'll answer some of the questions we weren't able to get to today. Guy, this was such a fantastic session. Thank you for your time and for sharing your insights and expertise. You have truly laid out how BAs can transition to the boardroom. To our audience, please don't forget to participate in our 2020 salary survey. A link to the survey will be included in the follow-up email you'll receive after today's presentation. If you're not a member of IIBA, we encourage you to join today at www.iiba.org and gain access to the premium benefits available exclusively to our members. Thank you for joining us today, and we'll see you next time.